Well, hello everybody. My name's Hermione Cockburn. I'm the Scientific Director here at Dynamic Earth, which is essentially Edinburgh's Science Centre, and I'm delighted to be taking part in the RSGS Inspiring People Talks programme. My talk today is called Discovering the Deep, and this is a story that goes back more than 150 years. And the inspiration for this story is ultimately the habitat that you're about to see on my first slide. This is a cold water coral reef on the Rockall Bank in the northeast Atlantic. Now this picture is taken about 500 metres water depth. All the light that you can see is coming from the remotely operated vehicle that took this image. It's absolutely pitch dark down there. And the main coral that you can see that provides the essential framework for these reefs is called Lophelia pertusa. And it grows throughout the North Atlantic and other ocean basins up to depths of more than 2,000 metres. Now, to me, these deep water corals, and we'll see more of them later on, create really intriguing marine habitats. And some of them are quite literally on our doorstep off the west coast of Scotland, but they remain relatively little known. So who discovered them and why are they important? Well, the story begins back in the mid-19th century. And this was a time when interest in the deep sea, for various reasons, was growing. And one of those reasons was the development of underwater telegraphy. These were the original submarine cables that were promising to revolutionise communication. Now today, more than I think 90% of internet traffic travels through undersea cables. It's a major part of our interaction with the deep sea in modern times. And one of the things that was needed to advance this technology was a good understanding of the depth of the ocean and the shape and the nature of the seabed. And these things back in the 1840s, 1850s were not well constrained at all. Marine science at that time was fairly disjointed. Science at sea was very expensive, just as it is today. And taking reliable measurements of basic parameters of things like temperature were made very difficult because of the conditions, water pressure at depth, for example. In the field of marine biology, naturalists were rather hampered by a widely held view that beneath about 300 fathoms, that's about 550 metres, there was no marine life. The deep was essentially considered lifeless and unimportant. This azoic zone theory, as it was called, azoic literally means devoid of life, had been put forward in 1843 by Edward Forbes. And it wasn't as crazy an idea as it sounds. In fact, it was quite reasonable. He reasoned that high pressure, lack of light, and very cold temperatures rendered life pretty much untenable at any great depth. Now, before we move on with the story, let me just bring you up to speed on a few of the facts about the deep sea. Now, today we think of the ocean in 5 depth zones, as shown in this diagram here. It's only in the top 200 metres that sunlight penetrates and photosynthesis by phytoplankton is possible. And that's busily producing up to 50% of the oxygen we breathe. When you go deeper, light diminishes very quickly into the top of the twilight zone and then down into the dark, vast expanses of the midnight zone and the abyss. The deepest parts of the ocean are found in trenches, and these are long, narrow features where tectonic plates meet, and that's known as the Hayward zone. And remember that the ocean covers 71% of the Earth, and a really vast part of it is actually deep ocean. Now, by the 1860s, evidence was coming to light that Edward Forbes' azoic zone, which would have included all of the ocean beneath the upper part of today's twilight zone. Well, the azoic theory was not completely accurate. Life was being dredged up from the deep, and some of it was on those undersea cables when they were brought back up for repairs. But the framework was really still entrenched in scientific thinking. And to truly shift that paradigm, a consensus based on extensive evidence needed to build up. So now let me introduce the hero of this story. And if each of these RSGS talks needs an inspiring person, then this is him. Charles Wyville Thomson. He was born in West Lothian. He went to school in Edinburgh. He studied at Edinburgh University before taking up academic positions in natural history in Scotland and over in Ireland. He was especially interested in the biology of the oceans. Near the start of his career, he'd actually worked with Edward Forbes, dredging in the Firth of Forth, and it's said that he accepted the truth of the Ozoic zone at that time. But, as I said, by the mid-1860s, things were not looking good for this theory, and he and others knew that it was becoming more and more difficult to accept. And Wyville Thomson was absolutely determined to investigate further. At this point in the story, CWT, as I like to call him, approached his friend William Carpenter, who was Vice President of the Royal Society. Now, together they were convinced if they could dredge in deep water, they would reveal something totally different from the accepted view. So they borrowed a couple of ships from the Navy, one of which Charles Wyville Thomson described as surely the oldest and most cranky paddle steamers in the Navy. And on a fairly demanding set of cruises, they dredged and they trawled off the west and north of Scotland. Here's one of the route maps of one of those expeditions and a glimpse of the equipment that they used on board. And what do you know? They found abundant animal life from as deep as nearly 2,500 fathoms. That's 4.5 kilometres. Carpenter reported life at these depths was not a degraded or starved residuum of animal life, but it was a rich and varied fauna. Not just that, at these depths off Scotland, they found variable and surprisingly warm temperatures in deep water, and that indicated that the ocean was circulating down at these significant depths, and that was another fierce debate going on at the time that they were contributing to. And all of this work that they did, it added up to a really significant contribution. Carpenter and Wyville Thomson did a fantastic job of disseminating the work effectively, and the reversal of opinion amongst the scientific community and the public who were fascinated by this was absolutely complete. It was hard to go back to a time and think the Ozoic zone had ever been believed. For Charles Wyville Thomson, our inspiring person, this marked the turning point in his career. He took up the Regius Chair of Natural History at Edinburgh, arguably the most influential position in natural history or natural sciences in the world, and he published about those porcupine and lightning cruises in his very well-received book, The Depths of the Sea. And you could say that it was this work in Scottish waters that marked the beginning of deep ocean oceanography, with the North Atlantic the cradle of marine biology as we know it today. Now, some of you might be anticipating the next part of the story. Carpenter and Wyville Thomson were not satisfied and went on to do something much, much bigger and better. But before I tell you about that, let's just have a look at that rich and varied fauna that they found off the north coast of Scotland. These images of the seabed at about 850 metres deep on what is now known as the Wyville Thomson Ridge. The ridge is a 70-kilometre long rocky plateau on the edge of the Scottish continental shelf, and it separates the Rockall Trough to the southwest from the Faroe Shetland Island to the northeast. And two water masses meet at this point. And the fauna on this rocky plateau, as you can see, it's vibrant, it's abundant, and it would have proved incredibly interesting and exciting as it came up in the dredge on those early research expeditions. So let's get back to the Discovering the Deep story. Wyville Thomson, supported by Carpenter, put forward the case for a major expedition. This was not just sticking to Scottish local waters. He wanted to go global. And the British government, not wishing to fall behind in international research spheres, came up with a ship. This ship, in fact, HMS Challenger. And Challenger was specially adapted for the scientific work that it was about to undertake. This was the very first time that a ship had been properly fitted out for science. Gun ports were taken out to make space for laboratories, and steam-powered winches and platforms were installed for the sounding and sampling equipment. And the result was the Challenger expedition. 3.5 years of pioneering circumnavigation to characterise the global ocean. On board, Charles Wyville Thomson was the chief scientist, and you can see him here resplendent in a white suit And in the small team of scientists, or scientifics as they were known by the crew, was also John Murray. John Murray lived longer than Wyville Thomson and went on to really make his mark after the expedition. And as a result, I think he's remembered a bit more widely in the history of marine science. And you may well have heard of John Murray if you weren't familiar with Wyville Thomson. Challenger set sail on the 21st of December 1872. It sailed around the world following this route map that you can see here, and it was trying to answer the big marine science questions of the day. Would living creatures be found in the deepest depths of the sea? Where were those deepest parts? What was the sea floor like geologically, topographically? Could currents measuring cold water from the poles to the equator be measured? And this is the route that they took. They sounded and dredged and measured current and sampled the water as they went. The ship's officers carried out the more standard measurements of weather observations, for example, routine observations needed to improve maps and possible routes for submarine cables. That was still a big focus of their work. But it was the naturalists on board who dealt with the contents of the trawls, the nets, the dredges that came in. And here in this image, you get to see some of that happening. This is the sounding platform, and here is a sketch showing a hole being sampled, sieves at the ready here, specimen jars, and then one of the labs where everything was analysed and bottled up and shipped back to Britain for analysis at the end of the expedition. And this work that they undertook, it was arduous, it was dangerous at times, and for some people became rather monotonous. Henry Moseley, one of the scientifics, wrote, "At first, when the dredge came up, every man and boy in the ship who could possibly slip away crowded round to see what had been fished up. Gradually, as the novelty of the thing wore off, the crowd became smaller and smaller, as the same tedious animals kept appearing from the depths. It is possible, even for a naturalist, to get weary of deep-sea dredging." I love that quote. Although apparently, Wyville Thomson never missed a dredge or a trawl coming up at any of the sampling stations, so I don't think he ever became weary of it. So what did Challenger achieve? What did they find? Well, incredible things. They found life at every depth, as you might imagine. They examined and preserved over 7,000 specimens, including almost 4,700 new species. They found a varied ocean floor, vast depths, including over 4,500 fathoms near the coast of Japan in the Northwest Pacific, what's now known as the Challenger Deep. That was a bit of a serendipitous find, but they did measure their deepest sounding at the deepest point, or very near the deepest point of what we know to be the ocean today. They found large mountains, subsea mountains forming continuous chains in the Atlantic and other places. These were, of course, the mid-ocean ridge system, as yet not fully understood. And they brought up a number of peculiar black sort of oval stones, oval bodies about an inch long. And this was the discovery of manganese nodules of interest to the deep-sea mining industry today. So what happened after the expedition? Well, Wyville Thomson, he returned to Edinburgh, and as expedition leader, he set about the huge task of assessing the enormous collection and data from the crews. He insisted on sending those collections to the best scientists internationally. The task took much longer than expected, and ultimately, it is said that the strain of the work made him ill. The first volume of the results was published in 1880, and he retired in 1881, dying in 1882. And on his death, a colleague wrote, "It will be a long time before we have one who knows so much and says what he knows in such a charming way." He was said to have a very warm and charming character. He cemented friendships with scientists from around the world, and it was those friendships and connections that Wyville Thomson established post-Challenger that really helped to build up the original international community of marine scientists, which very much underpins how the modern day science works too. John Murray, as I said, he took over and really made his mark after the expedition. And in 1895, 23 years after Challenger left Portsmouth, John Murray oversaw publication of the 50th and final report. John Murray described the Challenger expedition as the greatest advance in the knowledge of our planet since the celebrated discoveries of the 15th and 16th centuries. Now, his view might have been biased, there might have been a certain amount of publicity involved in that statement, but actually the claim is probably valid. The Challenger reports are an absolutely outstanding, incredible resource, an overview of the global ocean from 150 years ago. And together with the specimens, which are in various museums around the world, including here in Edinburgh, they are still extensively studied today, not least as a comparator. All this work was done before plastics, before climate change, and we can use Challenger to help us understand how the oceans have been evolving and changing ever since, and our impact on those environments, first really measured and recorded by Wyville Thomson. Now, in the final part of this talk, I want to head back to the Northeast Atlantic and tell you a bit about some more recent discoveries in the deep that build on that incredible foundation provided by Wyville Thomson and Challenger. When we head out to the west of Scotland, as you can see on this basic bathymetry map, we drop off the continental shelf into deeper waters. And these round features, these are seamounts. These are fantastic, enormous submerged volcanic mountains, higher than Ben Nevis when you measure them from the seafloor to their peaks, and real hotspots of biodiversity. This is the Rockall Bank that I mentioned in the introduction, and this feature here that you can just see is the Wyville Thomson Ridge. Exploring these places today, well, to my mind, if you look at this set of images, it doesn't look a million miles from the Challenger experience. But the ships these days are purpose-built. This is a Spanish research vessel. The scientists and the crew, they're a much more diverse group of people. The equipment is more sophisticated. This piece of equipment being lowered into the ocean is about to measure salinity and temperature right throughout the water column. And the labs on board, they're much more modern, of course. The understanding we're gaining of deep water habitats and ecosystems via the kind of research expeditions that this slide sums up, well, it's growing all the time. Just last week, this is at the end of November 2021, a really large-scale deep water research project led by the University of Edinburgh called iAtlantic, that was in the news. Because it's working out how the ocean is moderating and controlling our climate, how it's mitigating for rising CO2 and warming temperatures, and how it's supporting all life on Earth, and how life in the deep is responding to our impact. These are crucial questions that are being answered by modern-day Wyville Thomsons. So let me just take this opportunity to show you a few further ROV images of these amazing cold water coral communities that are out there in the Northeast Atlantic. These images were taken on various deep water expeditions. And this shows a beautiful fan coral on the Hebrides Terrace seamount. And they really are giving us a glimpse of the variety, the colourful nature of these incredible places. Now, interestingly, you don't have to go that far to find cold water corals. Since its discovery in just 2003, scientists have been exploring a rather rare inshore cold water coral community. This is the Mingalay Reef complex, located just a few kilometres off the island of Mingalay. Many species have been found associated with the reef. Lephelia pertusa, the coral that I introduced at the start of this talk, is the UK's only reef-forming coral, and it provides the foundation and an essential matrix for hundreds of species. The Mingalay Reef is about 150 metres deep. The temperature here is about 4 degrees. It's dark, but there's so much going on. It's one of the most important examples of inshore cold water coral reefs in the world, and it's been there for about 5,000 years. Now, some species, as you might imagine, they live on the reef all the time, but others depend on the reef at various times in their life cycle. For example, the deep water blackmouth cat shark comes back year after year to the same spots to lay eggs on the live corals that then go on to provide a crucial nursery habitat and so support the overall population of just this one example, exciting species. The good news is that the Mingalay Reef is within a marine protected area, so that means it is protected from certain threats, such as the highly destructive fishing method of bottom trawling, which poses a very serious threat to these slow-growing cold water corals. The bad news is that these corals have also been described as the canaries in the coal mine of much wider threats to them from climate change. The principal issue here is ocean acidification. And in very simple terms, rising levels of CO2 in the atmosphere alter the chemistry of seawater, and the ocean is gradually becoming more acidic. The pH is slightly dropping. And this affects the skeletons of the corals, specifically the dead coral infrastructure. And there is recent evidence and good lab-based support for the finding that Lophelia reefs are becoming unstable due to a process known as coral porosis, akin to osteoporosis, in which there is a weakening of this dead structure that forms the foundation of the reef. And that's all due to changes in ocean chemistry as a result of climate change. Now, an MPA isn't going to manage that threat. And at Dynamic Earth, we are keen to shine a light on both the marvellous historical heritage of these places and their precarious situation in the face of climate change. So that really concludes my story. This talk is part of a wider ocean literacy project called Discovering the Deep, and that has received funding from the Heritage Lottery Fund, so many thanks to them. At Dynamic Earth, we are creating a new exhibition that's going to open next April 2022, and that will tell all our visitors about Charles Wyville Thomson, about the Challenger expedition, and critically, make more people aware of cold water corals and the stunning ecosystems that we have off our coasts. Their stewardship is our collective responsibility. And I hope that Discovering the Deep is going to help inspire the progress that we need to make in tackling the climate crisis that will impact on these special places. If you're interested in finding out more or supporting us to deliver this project, please get in touch. Thank you very much for listening.